Okay, welcome back. We're still talking about motor control, and where we left off was we were going to be talking about refined movements, so that's what we're going to continue with right now. So here we are referring to our lateral muscles. This is outside the gray matter. The signal actually has two choices of how it gets to those muscles, coming up from these higher brain centers down to these muscles to make those choices of to contract or relax. The two choices are, one, it can go through interneurons, then they can then project to the lateral motor neurons, and then they will project to the distal muscles. That's our most common way. The most common way is that they're going to come from these higher brain centers, go to the lateral motor neurons, and they will project to the distal muscles via the interneurons of the spinal cord. Two, the signal can actually bypass the interneurons and go directly to the lateral motor neurons and project to the distal muscles. That's the least common way. However, we can bypass those interneurons and go directly to those distal muscles, but that is our least common way to do so. The most common way is that the signal would go through the interneurons of the spinal cord. So moving on from refined movement to postural control. For postural control, this signal cannot bypass interneurons. It has to go through these interneurons. So it must go through these interneurons to medial motor neurons to our proximal muscles. However, you cannot function if it is happening on one side of the body, so the signal must cross. So postural stability involves the contralateral side. Fine motor skills does not have to. So if I want fine motor control to take place, postural stability must occur on both sides and cannot bypass these interneurons. Postural control can occur without any lateral activity at all. So this means we cannot have lateral activity or fine control without having postural control. Okay, so let's move on to talk more specifically about this cortical spinal tract. One of the most important tracts for lateral control is this cortical spinal tract. The theory is that it's actually thought that the cortical spinal tract developed when animals went from walking on all fours to an upright posture, because now digital manipulation actually becomes very important. So the theory is that the cortical spinal tract was developed when animals went from on all fours to an upright posture, or it was much more developed. The lateral cortical spinal tract is said to be a portion of the pyramidal tract, since these tracts make an upside-down pyramid coming off of the brain. This tract transmits with great speed because there are not as many synapses along the way, so it doesn't have to go through all of that synaptic transmission. It kind of just shoots right through. This is our major tract responsible for digital manipulation. So if you all just wiggling your fingers right there as you're typing or writing or listening, you can thank this lateral cortical spinal tract. Your anterior tract helps control muscles of the trunk. Okay, so we have our cortex here and our signals coming down. And if we go down to our lateral corticospinal tract, this is going to control fine lateral movements, for example, digital manipulation. And if we branch off here, this anterior portion of the corticospinal tract is going to help with, is going to control muscles of our trunk. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about the extrapyramidal tracts. So these are the four tracts that are extrapyramidal, meaning outside the upside down pyramid of what we just talked about. One, we have the reticulospinal tract, the tectospinal tract, the tectobulbar tract, and the rubrospinal tract. These are all considered what's called polysynaptic because there are a multitude of synapses along the way. What does that mean? That means that they are much slower with regards to transmission in comparison to the pyramidal tract. Remember I just said with the pyramidal tract that there's very few synapses along the way, especially with that lateral cortical spinal tract, and that means the impulse can be sent with great speed with minimal interruption. These extrapyramidal tracts actually have multiple synapses along the way, so this signal is actually going to take longer or not be as efficient as the pyramidal or the those cortical spinal tracts. So 3 of the 4 regulate postural stability. So those are the rectospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract, the tectospinal tract, and the tectobulbar. The last one, the rubrospinal tract, sorry, these are tongue twisters half the time, tract works in concert with the pyramidal tract. So the lateral cortical-spinal tract. So the rubrospinal tract works in concert with the pyramidal tract, which is our lateral cortical-spinal tract. So those three with postural control means that they cross the midline. So those three can work independently of the other two. So our lateral cortico and our rubrospinal tract can work independently of the other two. The cortical spinal tract and the rubrospinal cannot work independent of the other three. So ultimately what that means is that we have to have postural control if we're going to have digital manipulation or lateral function. We cannot move our hand or have lateral control without postural stability. However, we can have postural stability without lateral control. So that's what we meant with those three. Postural control means that they cross the midline. They can work independently of the other two. So our lateral cortical spinal tract, which is part of our pyramidal tract, and then the one that works with it in concert with it, the rubrospinal tract. So the cortical spinal and the rubrospinal tract cannot work independent of the other three. So if the cortical spinal and the rubrospinal tract are working in order to control walking, lateral movement, fine manipulation, we have to have the other three working, which are our reticulo, our tecto, and our tectobulbar, our tectospinal, and our reticulospinal tract. So those have to be working in order for us to have lateral control or digital manipulation. Okay, so let's talk about lesions for a second and apply those to those different tracts. So if a person has a lesion in an extrapyramidal tract, they're going to wobble when they walk because we are talking about our postural tracts here. However, if they are provided with support, they can then walk normally, and if stationary, they can have digital manipulation, but they cannot have lateral control when they are mobile, right? Because that makes sense. They won't be able to have lateral control if they're walking if they don't have postural control. However, if someone stabilizes them or they have some sort of stabilization, they can have fine manipulation because they are then stabilized. If you have a lesion on the cortical spinal tract or the rubrospinal tract, which again involves our lateral tracts or involving our fine manipulation, you can walk normal, but even when stationary, you cannot have fine digital control. Because remember, again, we can't have fine motor movements without postural control. So if it's just something in our cortical spinal or our rubrospinal tract, which is affecting fine motor movement, we can still have postural control. Okay, so we're going to go to a diagram of these descending motor pathways, and I have uploaded for you as well to have. This gives you a good overview of postural and lateral control. Let me go here. So here we have our descending motor pathways. Right here is off to this over here is our command for postural equilibrium. So we go down here. This is we just want to maintain an upright posture or some sort of postural equilibrium. The signal goes down to our medial interneurons. Then that must cross to the other side. That signal must happen both on left and right sides in order for us to consider us having postural equilibrium. That signal will go to our medial motor neurons and then to our proximal muscles to keep us upright or to contract or to relax in order for us to do so. It's important to know that this pathway can occur by itself. Now, if we go over here, this is for refined movement. Command for refined movements, remember, can happen in one of two ways. Now, with postural control, it has to go through those interneurons. Only one way can it do that. However, the command for refined movements can go through one of two ways, right? So the first way is it can bypass these interneurons. The signal can come right from the cerebral cortex and the higher brain centers, directly land onto these lateral motor neurons, and then go to the distal muscles in order for us to contract or relax. Or the second way, which is the most common way, is the command for refined movements is to go to the lateral interneurons from the cortex first, to the lateral interneurons, then lands on our lateral motor neurons and tells our distal muscles what to do. This is the most common pathway. However, this pathway can still occur. This entire lateral movement or fine movements cannot occur without this occurring over here, this pathway occurring. So this pathway can occur by itself, but this pathway cannot occur without this pathway occurring first, if that makes sense. So we need postural equilibrium in order to have fine control. Okay, so there's also some lower brain centers in motor control. These lower brain centers reside in a number of different locations. Some are in the brainstem, some are in the midbrain, and some are in the cerebellum. So even though the cerebral cortex is the dominant location for motor control, what we've been talking about this whole time, there are other areas involved in motor control as well. However, we're not going to go into too much depth of these lower motor programs. I just wanted you to know that there are other motor programs out there which reside in these lower brain centers. You may get more in depth in other classes, such as neuro. Okay, so we're going to talk about the basal ganglia's role with motor control as well. Basal ganglia has a cluster of 3 nuclei. We have the caudate over here. We have the putamen and the globus pallidus, all right here. So these 3, cluster of 3 nuclei. All 3 locations play a role in motor control. The basal ganglia is thought to be nothing more than a processing center or an organizing center. This receives input from the cortex, and what does it do with this information? It processes and integrates the information and then makes a decision about an appropriate motor program. So it's an organizing center which will process motor signals coming from higher brain centers and make a decision relative to one of the stored motor programs that we have and hope it's going to be the appropriate one. So that's our summary statement for the most part. It's an organizing center which will process motor signals coming in from higher brain centers, and it's going to make the decision relative to one of our stored motor programs that we have, and we are going to hope that it's the appropriate one to carry out. So this is our organizing center. Okay, so now that we talked about that and choosing an appropriate motor program, we're going to talk about what a motor program is. This is just a set of commands that is assembled in the brain before a movement occurs. And after the motor program is assembled in the brain, it must be sent to the motor units. So now we have to assume that once it is sent to the motor units, that the appropriate timing and sequencing also has occurred. So I'll repeat that. What's the motor program? It's ultimately a set of commands that is assembled in the brain before a movement even occurs. After the motor program is assembled in the brain, it must be sent to the motor units in order for obviously it to be carried out. So now we have to assume that once it is sent to these motor units, that the appropriate timing and sequencing has occurred. So the appropriate planning and choice of that motor program has occurred in order for us to carry it out. That's what we have to assume at that point. Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about higher motor centers impacting our basal ganglia. There's going to be 3. We have our primary motor cortex, located in the frontal lobe of our brain. We have our premotor cortex, right here, also in the frontal lobe. And then we also have our supplementary motor area, which is also in the frontal lobe. All 3 of those locations are in the frontal lobe. So this is going to impact our basal ganglia. And remember, our basal ganglia is our organizing center for motorized control. So it's going to receive input from all 3 of those locations and is going to help organize and hopefully that we choose the appropriate motor program that we have stored. So these are the areas, higher motor centers, that are going to be sending information to our basal ganglia, and then basal ganglia is going to be that organizing center and hopefully choosing our correct motor program that we want to carry out. Once we choose that correct motor program, we are assuming once that signals and those signals get sent down to those lateral neurons or those postural neurons that we have assembled the correct motor program and we're going to be carrying out the correct one. We will be going on to our last video of of this lecture, and we're going to wrap up talking about a motor homunculus, as well as how do we monitor this motor program.